Good evening, everybody. I just started the recording for this evening's session, and I'm delighted that many of you could make it. I'll be recording the session for those who couldn't make it. I'm going to be talking about some steps tonight that are directly related to the assignment on managing poor performance, which will appear as, in essence, kind of a discussion board assignment, where you will be posting some responses and then responding to some other people's posts. It's important that you also look at some of the videos I've posted online about this topic. One of those videos provides some background information, especially about really important concepts that kind of everybody ought to be generally familiar with, such as employment at will, and what it means and what its limits are. I've also posted a video about if managing poor performance fails, then you reach a point where you have to terminate an employee or fire the employee, or whatever language your organization uses. And I have a separate video posted about that and how that process works. Please jump in anytime by unmuting yourself and ask any question you'd like. So I'm not an attorney, but this is some, I think, useful information that I wish I had had when I was younger. And the first time I ever had to let an employee go, I just kind of somebody who started off very strong and their performance continued to decline, and it began to have a very deleterious effect on the entire workplace. About 10 different people I was managing at the time. And I had no training in this area at all at the time. I was a rehabilitation counselor, and I had no idea what to do. And so I think it's really important that everybody just gets comfortable talking about these concepts. And one of the books that I looked at many years ago, this was its original publication date, way back in 1995. It has been revised and updated several times, so it has more recent dates if you look for it. It was a very helpful book in that regard. So, when we see poor performance, the first thing I always suggest that people think about is what's causing it. Because how you're going to respond to it is probably a function of what you think might be causing it. So at least initially, it would be good to go through this list. You know, does the person have the resources? Do they have the time? Do they have the tools? Do they have the support from other departments? Do they have the data they need? Are the expectations clear? Do they really understand what you expect, what the organization expects? Do they have the knowledge or skill to do the job well? Is their performance problem a result of just a lack of skill or knowledge? And I've certainly been in circumstances where I've seen that. But of course, sometimes we have people who have the resources, the expectations are clear, they have the skills, but they're not executing. They're simply not doing it. And those are often the most difficult ones for all of us to deal with. So this is kind of a general guide about coaching discussions and how you might structure those kinds of discussions around managing poor performance, just about managing poor performance. So I would say before you meet with somebody, there are a few things you ought to do. And you're not ready to meet until you've done these things. That's a mistake I made when I was young. I would just set up a meeting and sit down and start talking with the person, but I really didn't know how to prepare for that meeting. So I think we ought to begin by asking ourselves, what's the category of the problem? Is this a simple, straightforward kind of attendance, punctuality problem? Those are the easiest to deal with generally. Is this a performance problem? That is, they're generally civil and nice people, but their performance is poor. Or is this a conduct problem? And by that I mean they're violating key rules in the organization about how to treat others, And I've seen these kinds of things as well. I once worked someplace where I saw somebody pick up a chair in the lunchroom and throw it at somebody else. That's a conduct problem, you know. Usually it's best to try to deal with just one problem or one category of problem at a time. The next thing I find really helpful, and I really encourage you to do this, is to make two columns and head one of the columns with actual performance and head the other one with expected performance. And first, in the expected performance column, write down precisely what you want somebody to be doing. And right next to each of your expectations, write down what has actually happened. So just writing down in a very clear, specific manner what you observed and what you've seen. Don't make any inferences about why the person's doing what they're doing. Don't write down things like, oh, they're unmotivated, or they're not a team player, they have a lousy attitude. All of those things are inferences. We don't want to be writing those things down. We want to say, here's what I expected, here's what's actually happening. So these are simple examples. You know, I was doing some consulting for years with a company that was very serious about smoking. They actually made smoking cessation products. They were a global pharmaceutical company. And of course, employees were only allowed to smoke outside of the building. In fact, at this company, they were only allowed to smoke off the campus. You couldn't walk outside of the building. You had to get in your car and drive away and then smoke. And but you know, so that's the expectation. But you know, one time somebody saw somebody actually smoking in the back of the cafeteria. Unbelievable. Huh? Another real example that I experienced is simple expectation. This was in a bank. Employees are, you know, expected to respond courteously to customer questions. And so a branch manager told me that she heard a teller respond to a customer question by saying, "That's a pretty ridiculous question, isn't it?" Wow. You always think these things couldn't happen in real life, but of course they do. Next, you should jot down the good business reasons why this problem needs to be fixed. I mean, what you really are trying to anticipate here is, what if the employee just says, listen, this isn't a big deal. I don't see why it's a problem. You ought to have an answer for that. You ought to have an answer, because if it wasn't a big deal or a problem, you wouldn't be talking to the person. So why is it important? Is it affecting the performance of others? Is it creating a tolerance for a behavior that you don't want to see others engage in? When I was very young, I used to show up for a job I had in Hawaii. I was supposed to start at 8:30, and I always arrived about 8:35, 8:37. And that was because the bus I took to get there, this was in Honolulu, that's when it got in. And in order to get there earlier, I would have had to take a half an hour earlier bus. And I always finished my work really early in the day, so I knew I was getting my work done. I didn't think that 6 or 7 minutes mattered. And my supervisor said to me one day, you got to be here at 8:30. And I said, but to do that, I'd have to leave a whole half hour earlier, and I'd be here way in advance. And she said, you know what, if I'm going to start letting you come in 5 or 7 minutes late, I can promise you this, other people are going to start imitating that. So you know what, get here early. Okay, point well taken. A lesson I learned. Yeah, sometimes you need to learn lessons when you're 23 years old. The next thing is to think to yourself, what might be the consequences if the problem wasn't solved? You know, they're not always formal disciplinary things. Sometimes you're going to have to supervise the person more closely. Maybe they'll get less desirable work, or maybe they'll have a smaller salary increase, or perhaps they'll be moved into some kind of a more formal discipline process. But you ought to have at least thought about those beforehand. And then finally, think about what could be done to fix the problem. What could be done? At least jot down your ideas so you have some suggestions. You're going to ask the person if they've got thoughts too, but I think you ought to write down these 5 things before you meet with the employee. And once you have, then you're ready to meet. So next questions are, where should you meet? Well, obviously privacy is by far the biggest issue. If you've ever seen anybody disciplined in public, it's just terrible. Everybody else is embarrassed. The employee is embarrassed. It's just terrible. So privacy is huge. Often your own workspace might provide that kind of privacy. You don't want to do it in the employee's workspace. That's generally a bad idea. If you can find an empty conference room, that's a good idea. When should you meet? Well, make sure you have the facts before you meet. That might involve talking to some other people, getting the specifics of what somebody said to you earlier. And if there's any kind of formal disciplinary action, you ought to allow enough time to make sure that the action you're planning on taking is approved, either by your manager or by human resources or both. What should the tone of the meeting be like? How should the meeting proceed? I always say if it's the first time, if it's kind of a coaching conversation, this is not a major problem yet, try to be casual. Don't sit behind your desk in a formal manner. Relax, maybe sit next to the person, talk in a relaxed manner. This conveys to the person that we're just having a conversation here, trying to fix something that's come up, but you're not in a threatening tone. On the other hand, if it's a more serious problem, then it's often helpful for you to be on one side of a desk and them to be on the other side, with that desk largely cleared off. So there's really nothing else on it. It conveys, except maybe your notes that you prepared the meeting for. But otherwise, this kind of clean desk, you're on one side, the person's on the other, your posture is upright. That conveys to the person, without you having to say anything, that this must be serious. So that's a kind of subtle body language, and the way the space is arranged can be important as well. Who should be present? The rule is virtually always only you. There are rare exceptions. One obvious exception is if you're working someplace where the employee in question is represented by a union. Union contracts often specify that a union representative, such as a shop steward or somebody, needs to be there. You have to follow what's in the contract. The contract is legally binding. You have to do that. If you think this is a very serious problem, and you really need to reinforce the seriousness of this problem, then it might be okay to have a second person there. Somebody perhaps from human resources. Their presence there kind of conveys the seriousness of this. But otherwise, it should just be you, because when there's two people there and only one employee, the person really feels that they're being ganged up on. I had a colleague at LaSalle who, by the way, was asked to meet with the dean about something that I think everybody agreed was a fairly trivial thing, and the dean actually had the associate dean there during the meeting. And it was like, wow, why is that happening? And then finally, how long should this meeting take? The biggest mistake I made when I was young is that my meetings took way too long. It was almost like I was trying to counsel the employee. I guess I was used to that because I was a rehabilitation counselor. That was kind of my mindset, but that's exactly the wrong way to do it. You want the meeting to be short, well planned, and in general, it should never exceed 20 minutes. It can often be much quicker than that. So what do you do to get things started? I think it's important to get to the point fairly quickly. People often ask me, should you start off by saying something positive? And that can be a problem if you spend too much time doing that. I've seen people who spend so much time telling the person how much they're valued and talking about all these examples of good things they've done in the past, and then they slip in quickly their dissatisfaction with a particular issue, and then they go back to telling the employee how fine they are, and the employee never gets to the point of the meeting. So I think it's fine to say something simple and to the point. Hey, Chris, I've told you several times in the last 6 months how much I've appreciated some of the work you've done, and that I do value you as an employee. But then right away, get to the point. but today, Chris, I want to talk to you because I've got a problem and I'm going to need your help to get it fixed. Or this other language, I'm dealing with a situation that's been bothering me. I'm going to need your help to get it resolved. The idea of that kind of language is that you're not accusing the person of anything yet. But it also makes it clear that there is a problem and that the person's involved. Now, I wouldn't recommend following anybody's script. I always think that's a bad idea. Try to find language that works for you, but you're trying to convey this idea that something's on your mind, there's a problem, you're worried about something, and I need to talk to you because I'm going to need your help to get this situation fixed. Then you go to your notes. Remember before I said you were writing down, here's what's expected and here's what's happened. Say that. Say, Chris, I really expect that when one of our marketing managers gives us a request and they tell us, here are the questions they'd like to see in the market research study that they're asking you to design. I expect that we're going to use their questions. And unless you think there's a really good reason not to do so, in which case you ought to talk to the marketing manager about it. But I heard that this last study we did for Tony over in marketing didn't use all the questions that Tony wanted. And he was upset because he was really looking forward to getting some answers to those questions. So, what's going on? What happened? So all you're trying to do here is just, however you're doing it, and you can rehearse this in advance, say, here's what we expected, here's what happened. You don't have to say, obviously there's a difference. The person will get that, right? So it's just, here's what happened, here's what I expected. Talk to me about it. What's going on? What do I need to know about it? Not something negative like you're talking to an adolescent, like what do you have to say for yourself, or something crazy like that. It sounds like you're talking to a 13-year-old. Just let the person talk. Let the person talk. They know now, here's the issue. Here's what was expected. They know now, here's what happened, at least as you see it. And then you're not accusing them yet of anything. You're just saying, tell me about it. What's going on? What do I need to know? Because they might tell you some information that you did not yet know, and that might really change your view of the situation. Or they might not. But you need to listen. Give them a chance to talk. Ultimately, and this is your goal, you need to get to a point where you get the employee's agreement to do and to meet your expectations. And you need to be really concrete about that. So these are just a couple of examples at the bottom of the page. Hey Beth, it's important that no customers ever kept waiting unnecessarily. Do I have your agreement that whenever you're doing any kind of paperwork or anything like that, and a customer comes up, you'll pause and you'll attend to the customer right away? Can I get your agreement to do that? And ask it as a question, because what you're trying to do is get the person to say yes. So Pat, look at I said that. My expectation is that when a marketing manager gives us a set of questions for a research study, we're going to use those questions. Do I have your agreement that you'll do that? And if for some reason you think the questions aren't good questions, that you'll go back and talk to the marketing manager and try to get agreement on a revised set of questions. And if that doesn't work, you'll come to me and talk about it before we take any steps. Do I have your agreement that that's how we're going to handle things going forward, and that's how you'll handle them? So make it an explicit question. And there are more examples in these slides. These slides will be, again, posted on Canvas as well. But they're just more examples of that same concept. If the person's just kind of yeah, sure, you need to be specific. If they're like, like an adolescent just trying to get you to stop talking. Yeah, sure, whatever. Yeah. Just say that. Okay, I just want to be clear. What exactly are you agreeing to right now? What are you agreeing to do? So that's the basic structure of the meeting. Now that meeting, you don't know what's going to happen when you start having the conversation with the employee, but you know how it's going to start. You know how you're going to do the actual versus the expected. and you know that your ultimate goal is to reach a point where the two of you can agree on something, and you will ask explicitly about that agreement. And when the person agrees, you're going to thank them. Now, if the problem continues, a month, a week, 3 months down the road, then you have to have another conversation. And I think in that other conversation, it's fair to say, listen, last time we talked, you agreed you were going to handle this situation by doing X, Y, and Z. But I heard recently, there was this situation, and that's not how you handled it. And we need to talk about that. So it's fine to bring up agreements that have been made and broken in the past. Okay. A couple of just general things that I found very helpful. People are constantly, I wouldn't say constantly, but I would say often, trying to provide a comment that throws you off your game. So here's the focus of responsibility has to stay on the employee. Fixing it has to stay on the employee. So this is a great example of what Dick Rody calls the yeah but game. So imagine this circumstance. A person keeps coming in late, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever it is, and this happens over and over again, and you're talking to the person and they say, you're absolutely right. I agree, I'm late. I feel horrible about it. I feel really badly about it. Here's what's going on. My husband works the second shift. He doesn't get back until a little bit after midnight. Of course, the kids go to sleep before then, but I do let them visit with their dad when he gets in, just for like 30 minutes, because, I think you could agree it's important that the kids get to see their dad each day. And so they do that. And then by the time they get back to sleep, it's real hard to get them up and out of the house in the morning. And this is a recurring problem. And that's why I keep showing up late. And you need to avoid at that moment, whenever an employee does something like that to you, the temptation to try to solve their problem. Don't say, hey, geez, have you thought about doing this? Maybe that's a way to solve this problem. No. Just say, listen, that sounds like a tough situation. I'm listening to you, and I can see that's a difficult situation. How are you planning on handling that so that you can get here every day on time? So the person can describe a difficult situation to you, but in the end, you have to be clear that the expectation has to be met. Don't let them talk you out of that, and it's not your job to solve that. You can express empathy, genuine human empathy, but it's not your job to solve that problem. Another thing people will do is what's called the irrelevancy game. So they'll say something like, oh yeah, this is not my first market research job. I've had other market research jobs, and that's not how they handle things where I used to work. I think the way they handled it in my old company, that was way better than the way you want to handle it here. This is not the time to debate that. So you have to do what they call dismiss and redirect. And a simple example of that is in this quote at the bottom. Look, as far as how they used to handle things where you work, that might be a conversation we could have someday. But right now, I need you to agree that when a marketing manager gives us a set of questions, we're going to use all those questions unless they've signed off on a revised set of questions. Do I have your agreement? You're going to do that, Tony? So don't get caught. Don't try to defend the way you're doing it versus somebody else. Don't get into that debate. Just dismiss it. Okay, that's interesting. Sometime we might have a conversation about that. But right now, so you're pulling them right back to where you are. Close the discussion. Thank them for taking the time to do this. If there's no disciplinary action, you don't think I have to say anything. If there has been some disciplinary action, if you saw this conversation, for example, as a verbal warning or a verbal reminder, as some people call them, you need to say it. You need to say that explicitly. The employee needs to hear that directly. You can't say to yourself, oh, it was a verbal conversation, and I did warn them that this needs to be fixed, so I guess they know it's a verbal warning. Nope. It's not one until you say it is. After the meeting, what do? This was where I screwed up the first time I ever had to deal with this. I never took notes about the meeting. I must have met with this guy 5 times over the course of 6 months. Every time I thought it was a good meeting and things were going to get better, and every time they didn't. And finally, somebody who was outside the organization was coaching me, and this person said to me, how many times have you met with him? And I said, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, 6. And he said, well, don't you have the dates written down and what you talked about? I felt like an idiot, you know? And no, I didn't. So after the meeting, record the date you talked, jot down what you talked about, write exactly what the employee agreed to do. If there's anything you agreed to do to be helpful, write that down. Write down anything else that might be useful later on. Document the meeting, at least in terms of your own notes. Okay. I'm going to talk about other ways to handle that in a minute, but let me pause. Does anybody have a question at this point? Okay, let me move on a little bit. Just a few more things to go through. Again, if you're going to give somebody an oral reminder or even a written reminder or warning, you need to ask yourself some obvious questions. Again, lots of similarity to what I just talked about. But the difference between a coaching conversation and a more formal disciplinary conversation really is only in the fact that at the end, you're saying to the person, this conversation under the company's policy represents an oral reminder or an oral warning under the company's policy. You're just saying it. Otherwise, you're doing everything else the same. You're preparing the same way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah? No differences. But you need, if you're going to do anything formal, you should make sure it was approved by somebody in advance. I'm not making this up, about 30 years ago, I was working in a group where the manager fired somebody and hadn't gotten approval to do it. And they had very weak documentation. And the person went down to a human resource office, showed the people in human resources her last performance review, which was pretty favorable, indicated that she had never received any written documentation about a problem and that she'd just been fired. And within an hour, an employment attorney called up from the company's employment attorney called up the boss and said, you can't do what you just did. She's coming back. Woo! You can imagine the mess that was. Okay. So again, after the meeting, always document the discussion. Sometimes it's fine to just keep notes for yourself. Although if I was going to do that, here's what I do. A nice trick, and employment attorneys will love you if you do this. Rather than just jotting down some notes, send yourself an email with the notes. That's wonderful. And employment attorneys love that because it can be verified when you sent the notes. You're not making it up after the fact, because the electronic trail will indicate that you sent the notes on a certain date. Of course, another really nice approach can be to send a follow-up note to the employee. That's often said if you're only dealing with a first coaching conversation or maybe even an oral reminder or warning. You know, Tony, thanks for taking the time to talk with me today. I'm glad we had a chance to talk. I mentioned that, my expectations were X, Y, and Z, and I had noticed that hadn't happened in this particular project. After talking about it, you agreed that from now on, you're going to handle things by doing, J, K, and L. I'm really delighted that you agreed to do that. I think that's going to fix the problem. And I'm really pleased with our conversation. And again, I want to thank you for doing that. And I look forward to working with you on this. And if you've got any questions about anything I said here, please get in touch with me. And so it's written in a tone that's kind of positive, but it's also a documentation of the discussion that the employee receives in a non-threatening tone. Now, if you reach a stage where some companies have something more formal, that's a written kind of formality, Some companies call these performance improvement plans. You may have those in your own company. Some companies actually refer to them as written reminders or written warnings. But under any circumstance, again, make sure you have approval beforehand, and don't write up anything before the meeting. Simply conduct the meeting the way we've been talking about. Here's the expectations. Here's when we've met on previous dates. Here's what's happened since then. My expectation is after our last meeting that nothing was going to happen because you had agreed to X, Y, and Z. But something has happened since then, and on this date this happened, etc. So we need to talk, and I need to get you to agree to handle it this way. Do I have your agreement to all of that stuff? Inform the person at the end that this constitutes a performance improvement plan or a written warning under the company's policy. And then after the meeting's done, then document it in a formal way. So you might say, here are the participants. When did we meet? Where were we? Here's the problem. Here were the dates when we've spoken in the past. What's happened since then? State that the situation needs to be corrected, not improved. Employment attorneys hate the word improved. It's very debatable. Corrected is a better word. Be specific about what you're looking for. Thank the person if they've agreed to do something in this last meeting. Say that's really good. I'm glad you made that agreement. That's really good. And be explicit about what the employee agreed to do, and state that you believe that the employee is going to do that. And send that to the person. Or you can call them into your office and have them review it and give them a hard copy of it. But I would also send it to them. You don't actually have to have them sign it. If I ask you to sign something, it sounds like I don't trust you, doesn't it? It's almost like I'm saying to you, listen, I don't trust you. So the only way I can know that you're not going to lie in the future about this matter is to have you sign it, so we'll actually have your signature. At that point, the tone is so negative that the relationship's just shot. Employees virtually never say that no such meeting occurred, especially when you followed it up in writing. And again, with an email, it's easy to do that. Right? Beyond that, some companies take additional steps. If the problem recurs, they have what they call a paid decision-making leave. I won't go into a lot of detail about that, but it's an interesting idea. It basically says to the employee, listen, we had this conversation on this date, I had another conversation on this date, and you've seen the written information I sent to you, but since then, X, Y has happened, and so here's what I need you to do. I need you to take tomorrow off. I'm going to pay you. What I want you to do tomorrow is think really carefully about whether or not you want to resign or whether or not you want to stay. And in order to stay, you would come back and you would agree that you're going to handle things from now on by doing, A, B, C, D, whatever that is. And the employee might say, no, I don't need a day off. I already know. I want to stay. I'm going to say no. This is so important. I want you to take the day off and think about it really, really seriously. And I don't want you to be worried about pay or anything like that. So just take the day off. Don't worry about it. We'll pay you. When you first come in the next day, I want you to stop by my office and let me know what your decision was. Have you decided you want to resign, or have you decided that you really want to stay and you're going to do X, Y, and Z going forward? So some companies do that, and it's kind of a nice idea. I think it's better than just suspending somebody or something like that, which I think gains virtually nothing. So I'm going to skip over some of these slides here and just kind of close with the idea that a question that people often ask is whether or not any kind of disciplinary action can ever be deactivated. And I actually think that's a good idea, and a number of people think it's a good idea. It might not be forgotten, but it's at least deactivated. So the idea might be if somebody, there was some kind of formal discipline, after some period of time, if everything is great, you can say, we're going to wipe the slate clean. And these are examples, maybe if it was an oral conversation, verbal conversation, maybe that happens after 6 months, or if it was something more serious and it lead to something written, maybe it's a year or a year and a half. if you reach the point where there was a decision-making leave or a suspension, then probably even longer. And you just take any kind of documentation about that and put it into a separate file. It's not like you've trashed it or deleted it. It's just not in that file. So as far as anything formal goes, it's been deactivated. The employee's kind of earned a clean slate. Now, obviously, if things don't go well after all this, you reach a point where you have to terminate the employee. And one lesson I learned, again, when I was young, and I learned it the hard way, as I learned many lessons, is that when an employee is messing up, initially, people are upset at the employee. The coworkers are upset at the employee because it's usually causing a problem for them. But after a while, they stop being upset at the employee and they start being upset at you because you're not doing anything about it, damn it. And why should they work so hard and be so responsible and so conscientious when this person's getting away with all of this? So you have to be able to make that decision. You have to be able to make that decision. Now, I have an entirely separate video about how a termination discussion goes, and you can watch that video. Termination discussions are completely different than what we just talked about. They are usually extremely short. I have witnessed many termination discussions in my life because I used to do employee relations in a casino when I was about 30 years old. And because of my job, I was kind of the third party who was there. The shift manager or the casino manager would call somebody in for a termination. They always wanted to have another witness there who just sat silently. I was that person. I watched lots of those. They're very quick. They're usually less than 5 minutes in length. They are very, very fast. And how they proceed and the best way to handle those and what to say to people afterwards is discussed in that video. The things I described here should really help you with the assignment that is the assignment for this week. And if you apply those concepts, I think you're going to do a really good job with that assignment. And I hope that because very few people cover these kinds of things in graduate classes or MBA programs, I hope that at least covering it here in this module is a chance for you to just feel comfortable about ways to proceed in these kinds of circumstances. Before I close, any final questions? Okay. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. Anything you want to ask me or give me a call, that's always, of course, fine. Be delighted to do that. In the meantime, I hope this will not only help you with the assignment, but I hope it will provide a framework for you that allows you to structure these things and have these conversations in a way that makes it, they're never easy, but a bit more comfortable than they might have been without this kind of structure and ideas about how to prepare, conduct the session, and how to handle things afterwards. I hope the rest of you have a great week, and I will post this online probably either tomorrow or Thursday. I'm not sure which. And have a great evening. Enjoy the warm weather, everybody. Good night.